When he finally turned onto the old road that led to his property, he felt a mix of excitement and quiet relief. A full year away had felt much longer than he expected. He had counted the months and then the weeks, imagining the moment he would step onto his land again. The place had always felt like a small escape from the world, a corner of peace he had earned through years of work. He thought everything would look exactly how he left it, simple and familiar, maybe a little dusty, but still the same. He was not prepared for what he saw instead. Even from a distance, the area looked different. The old road had been repaved with bright new asphalt. Fresh streetlights lined both sides like they had grown overnight. As he kept driving, he slowed the car, staring at the houses that appeared where he remembered nothing but open land and trees. These weren't small houses either. They were large, shiny, expensive-looking homes with long driveways, trimmed lawns, and tall decorative pillars in front. They looked like mansions someone would build in a high-end gated community. Not on the quiet land he remembered. He stopped the car in the middle of the road for a few seconds, unsure if he was in the right place. He checked the navigation again, but the blue dot blinked exactly where he expected it to be. He knew these roads better than any app, and he knew for sure that none of these houses had been here when he left. A strange feeling rose inside him, something between confusion and disbelief. He kept driving slowly, hoping maybe the houses were built beside his property, not on it. Maybe the development was close but not overlapping. But the more he looked, the more he felt something was very wrong. His land had always been easy to spot. It stretched wide and open, a quiet piece of earth with old trees, a small storage shed and a line of wooden posts marking the boundaries. Now, all he saw were manicured yards, cars parked neatly in driveways, and unfamiliar faces walking around like they belonged there. When he reached the spot where his property marker used to stand, he pulled the car to the side and stepped out. The air felt different. He took a deep breath and looked around carefully, trying to place himself. On his left, a 3-story house towered over him, complete with balconies and huge windows. On his right, another big house sat where he knew the line of trees once stood. His heart sank. His land wasn't beside these houses. It was under them. He walked forward slowly, feeling like he was stepping into someone else's life. The grass under his feet wasn't the wild, uneven grass that used to grow on his property. It was that perfect, bright green kind no one can grow without paying someone to manage it. He ran his hand through it just to be sure, as if touching it would explain something. It didn't. He noticed a couple standing on one of the porches. They watched him quietly, whispering something to each other. When he looked their way, they pretended to go back inside. Another neighbor stepped out of a car and paused when he saw him, like he didn't know whether to greet him or avoid him. It was strange, as if everyone already knew who he was. Even though he had never seen these people before, he kept walking toward where his shed should have been. That shed had been on the property long before he ever bought the land. It was old, sometimes wobbly when the wind blew too hard, but he loved it for its history. But now, instead of the shed, he found a paved driveway and 2 luxury cars parked side by side. His shed was gone, completely gone. Not moved, not relocated, not covered. It simply didn't exist anymore. His chest tightened. He looked up at the house standing there and tried to imagine how anyone had built something so big without ever questioning who owned the land. He walked along the edge of the driveway, checking for any trace of his old fence posts. They had been removed too. The land looked like it had never been his. Like someone had erased all the signs of his ownership and replaced them with new homes, new faces, and new stories. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Somehow, while he was gone for a year, someone had built expensive houses on his property without him knowing. He tried to replay the months in his head, searching for any signs that something like this could have happened. He remembered paying his property taxes. He remembered checking mail forwarding when he left. He remembered asking a friend to keep an eye on things, although that friend had moved away halfway through the year. But even then, how could something this big happen without anyone contacting him? He took out his phone and tried calling the county office. It was late in the afternoon, and the call went straight to voicemail. He knew he wouldn't get answers until the next day. He stood there quietly, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. It felt unreal, almost like a dream he would wake up from. But the large homes in front of him were real, the trimmed grass was real, and the uncomfortable stares from new neighbors were real. As he walked back toward his car, he heard a voice call out to him. It was a man from across the street, standing near a mailbox. The man hesitated before speaking again, as if he wasn't sure he should get involved. "Hey, are you new here?" the man asked cautiously. He shook his head. "No, I own land here." The man's expression changed instantly. He looked around nervously, lowering his voice. "Oh, you're that guy." He frowned. "What guy?" The man glanced back at the nearest house, then took a few steps closer. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just saying. They've been talking about you." "The HOA, I mean," felt his stomach turn. "Talking about me? Why?" The man shrugged like he didn't want to say too much. "I don't know the whole story. Just that there were problems with some land paperwork last year. Something about plots not being claimed. Honestly, no one here really knows what happened. We're just people who bought houses." He nodded slowly, though the explanation made no sense. He thanked the man, who quickly walked away, clearly not wanting to get involved. That small exchange made the whole situation feel even stranger. Not only had someone built on his land, but people already knew about him. It was like the neighborhood had been expecting this moment, waiting for him to return and see what they had done. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine. He watched the quiet community, children playing near the sidewalks, people walking their dogs, families sitting on their porches. None of these people knew the land they lived on belonged to someone else. None of them knew the person who had worked for years to buy that land was now standing there, trying to understand how it had been taken over. The sun was setting, and the last rays of light made the big houses glow softly. They looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But he couldn't enjoy the view. Not when he knew something was deeply wrong. He drove away slowly, feeling like he was leaving behind a part of himself. He didn't know exactly what happened, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this go. Later that evening, he checked his old property documents again. The deed was still in his name. The boundaries were the same. Everything was legally his. He stared at the papers, then back at the photos he took earlier of the new houses. The contrast was painful. How could such a big mistake happen? And who allowed it? He tried calling a few neighbors who used to live near his property, but many numbers were disconnected. Some had moved away. Others simply didn't answer. The only message he got back was from an old friend who said the neighborhood had changed a lot and that a strict HOA had taken control of everything in the area. That made him uneasy. He had never been part of any HOA. His land wasn't even in a neighborhood when he bought it. The idea that an HOA had spread far enough to include his land without him knowing felt impossible. He hardly slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured the huge houses sitting on the place he had invested years of savings into. He remembered the excitement he felt the day he bought the land. He remembered planting a few small trees and imagining what he would build there someday. He remembered thinking it would always be his safe place, his quiet corner of life. The next morning, as soon as the county office opened, he drove there. He walked inside with his documents in hand, expecting answers. But when he reached the counter and asked about his property, the clerk looked confused at first. She typed on her computer, checking files, then frowned. "It shows the land is still under your name," she said. "There's no record of any sale or transfer." He felt both relieved and angry. Then how did all those houses get built on it? The clerk hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know. Nothing here says the land was reassigned. Nothing says you lost ownership. So someone built houses on private property without permission?" The clerk looked uncomfortable. "It shouldn't have happened. But I can't speak on behalf of any development or HOA. All I can say is, you're still the legal owner." Her words stayed with him all day. He didn't confront anyone yet. He wanted to understand the full situation before taking the next step. But deep inside, he felt something shift. A quiet determination formed. He wasn't just confused anymore. He wanted the truth. and he knew he would find it, no matter. One thing was clear. This wasn't a small mistake. This wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Someone had made decisions about his land without him. Someone had to answer for it. He drove back toward the neighborhood one more time before heading home. As he approached, he saw people glance at his car again. Their expressions were a strange mix of curiosity and worry, as if they knew something he didn't yet. He parked for a moment, watching the homes quietly. These buildings were massive, expensive, and permanently rooted into the earth he legally owned. He knew the situation would become complicated. He knew there would be arguments, explanations, maybe even legal battles. But as he looked at the houses, he felt oddly calm. Because for the first time since he returned, he understood something clearly. He hadn't lost anything. They had built on his land, which meant someone owed him answers, and sooner or later, they would owe him much more than that the next morning. After leaving the county office with more questions than answers, he drove straight to the HOA building. It was a tall, white structure at the edge of the neighborhood, with polished steps, glass doors, and a sign that looked newer than the houses themselves. He parked the car and stared at the entrance for a moment, trying to steady himself. He wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly he was confused, and behind the confusion was a quiet frustration that had been building since the moment he saw the first mansion on his land. He walked inside and found a waiting area with dark chairs and a long desk behind a glass window. A woman sat there typing on a computer. When she noticed him, she smiled politely and asked if he needed help. He told her he needed to speak with someone from the board, preferably the president. The smile on her face faded. She cleared her throat and said she would check who was available. She disappeared behind a frosted glass door. Leaving him alone in the quiet room, he could hear muffled voices behind the door, hurried whispers that made him wonder if they already knew who he was. When the woman returned, her expression was stiff, and she told him someone would be out shortly. After almost 15 minutes, a tall man walked into the room. He wore a button-down shirt and carried a clipboard, even though there was nothing written on it. His smile looked forced, like he was trying too hard to seem friendly. He introduced himself as one of the board members and asked how he could help. He didn't waste time. He explained that he had returned after a year, only to find houses built on his land. He explained that the county confirmed he still owned the property. He asked how construction happened without his permission. The board member's smile slowly faded as he spoke. By the time he finished talking, the man was gripping the clipboard tightly. The board member cleared his throat and nodded a few times before speaking. He said there had been miscommunications during the development phase. The HOA had been told by a developer that the land was open for use and that ownership issues had been resolved. The more he spoke, the more it sounded like excuses, not explanations. He asked if the HOA had ever checked the property records. The board member looked uncomfortable and admitted they had relied on the developer's information. He said they had sent notices to the address listed on record, but all mail had been returned. When asked why they didn't verify ownership through the county, the man mumbled that they were under pressure to approve the development quickly as he listened. He felt his frustration growing. It wasn't anger yet, just a deep disbelief at how careless the process had been. They had taken someone's land, built homes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and didn't bother to check if the land was even available. It felt irresponsible, almost unreal. He asked where the HOA president was, saying he wanted to hear from the person in charge. The board member paused, then said the president wasn't available. He didn't sound convincing. It was clear the man didn't want him talking to the president, at least not yet. He left the HOA office with no real answers and a feeling that they were hiding something. If the situation had been a simple mistake, they would have apologized, tried to fix it, and certainly talked to him openly. Instead, they acted like they hoped he would disappear again as he walked back to his car. He noticed a couple of homeowners looking at him from a distance. They quickly turned away when he made eye contact. The feeling that people were whispering about him grew stronger. He decided to walk around the neighborhood again, this time paying closer attention to the details. He looked at the houses, the yards, the sidewalks. It all looked planned, neat, almost too perfect. the kind of perfection that comes from people wanting to make a strong impression. But underneath that perfection was a tension he could feel. He saw it in the way people paused their conversations when he passed. He saw it in how some avoided eye contact. Near one of the houses, he saw a man sitting on his porch reading a newspaper. The man looked older, calm, and less guarded than the others. He approached him politely and asked if he had lived there since the houses were built. The man lowered his newspaper and nodded. He asked how long the construction took, and the older man said it had all happened very quickly. The developer pushed everything forward at an unusually fast pace, promising a beautiful community with luxury homes. When he asked if anyone had mentioned ownership issues, the man hesitated. He said there were whispers early on, something about missing documents or unclear land rights. But the HOA told everyone it was being handled. They said the land had been vacant for years, and that everything was approved. He said buyers trusted the HOA because the neighborhood around. This area had been expanding for a while. The older man sighed and said he never believed something this big could have been done without permission. He looked at him carefully, almost sympathetically, and said he hoped things could be resolved peacefully. It wasn't the older man's fault, and he thanked him for the honesty. But the conversation confirmed what he feared. The HOA knew there were issues, but they ignored them. He went back to his car and drove to his old property boundary again. Standing there, he imagined how the land used to look before the development changed everything. He remembered walking there during quiet evenings, listening to the wind rustle the trees. Now there were houses filled with people who had no idea their homes stood on land that wasn't rightfully theirs. He walked along what used to be the border, trying to picture how developers could have mapped out the land incorrectly. But the more he looked, the more it became clear that they didn't map it incorrectly. They just didn't map it at all. Someone had assumed the land was free, or they hoped no one would come back to claim it. The thought made him uneasy. Later that evening, he decided to try contacting the developer directly. He searched for the company's name online and found an office number. He called, but the receptionist said the person who handled the site was no longer with the company. She gave him an email address for someone else. But there was no guarantee they would respond. He sent a message explaining everything and attaching copies of his property documents. He didn't expect a quick answer, but he wanted to make sure his side of the story was officially recorded. Then he sat back and wondered what step to take next. The situation was more serious than he had imagined. It wasn't just a mistake. It looked more like recklessness, or something worse. He spent the night thinking about all the possibilities. He tried to understand how an entire organization could make such a big error. He wondered if the HOA had hoped he would never return. He considered whether the developer had taken advantage of the HOA's trust, or whether both sides had ignored the rules to get the project finished faster. None of the possibilities made him feel better. The next day, he decided to return to the HOA office unannounced. When he walked in, the same woman at the desk looked startled. She asked if he had an appointment, and he told her he didn't need one. He was the legal owner of the land under several of the houses, and he deserved answers. This time, 2 board members came out instead of 1. They led him to a small meeting room with a round table. The room felt too neat, like it was staged for important conversations only when needed. The 2 men sat across from him, looking uneasy. They said they understood his concerns. They needed more time to review the situation. He asked them how many houses were built on his land. They looked at each other before admitting that at least 3 properties overlapped significantly with his boundaries. He asked if any of the homeowners were told about the issue. They said no, because they didn't want to cause unnecessary alarm. He asked if the HOA had ever tried to contact him after the returned mail. They said they had not. They assumed he had moved permanently. His jaw tightened at that. They assumed. They acted on assumptions instead of facts. He asked for the name of the developer, representative who told them the land was available. The board members hesitated again. One of them finally said they would look for the records and get back to him. The lack of transparency frustrated him. When he asked to speak to the HOA president again, they repeated that the president wasn't available. He could tell they were trying to shield him from. After leaving the meeting room, he walked outside feeling a mixture of frustration and determination. He knew now that the HOA wasn't going to help willingly. They had made a mistake so big that admitting it might destroy their credibility. They would try to delay, avoid responsibility, or even blame someone else. But he wasn't intimidated. He had proof, and the law was on his side. As he walked past one of the homes on his land, a woman stepped outside and asked if he was okay. Her tone was kind, unlike the cautious whispers he heard from others. He told her he was fine, and she asked if he was the person who used to own the big empty lot that everyone talked about. He nodded. She sighed. She said she had heard something from one of the construction workers before the houses were finished. Apparently, there had been confusion about who truly owned the land, and one of the workers had joked that they were building before the owner came back. The woman said she didn't think much of it at the time because she assumed the HOA would never approve anything without checking everything properly. Her words stuck with him. It meant some people knew there was an issue from the very beginning. He thanked her for sharing. She gave him an apologetic look before going back inside. As he drove away again, he made up his mind. He needed legal help. Not because he wanted to fight, but because it was clear the situation would otherwise be pushed aside or ignored. He didn't want conflict. He just wanted justice, clarity, and respect for the land he worked so hard to earn. He spent the next day gathering every document he could find. Old photographs, tax receipts, county maps, property surveys, everything that proved the land was his and had always been his. He put them all in a folder and looked at them with a strange mix of pride and sadness. This land had been a dream for him, a place he planned to build on someday. And now he was fighting just to have his ownership recognized again. He called a local attorney who specialized in property issues. The attorney listened carefully, asked a few questions, and seemed surprised by the scale of the situation. He scheduled a meeting for the following week and asked him to bring all documents as he hung up the phone. He felt something shift inside him. For the first time since returning, he felt a sense of direction. The situation was still messy, still confusing, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who understood the system, someone who could help him uncover the truth. He knew the road ahead would not be simple. The HOA would likely resist. The homeowners, once they found out, might panic. The developer might deny everything. But none of that changed the reality. The land was his, and he would fight for it not out of anger, but out of principle. He stood outside and looked toward the horizon where the new houses stood, bright and bold in the afternoon sun. They looked peaceful on the outside, but underneath that peace was a story that had been hidden for too long. Now it was time for that story to come out. When he woke up the next morning, he felt more tired than when he had gone to sleep. It was the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from working hard, but from trying to stay calm while everything around him felt upside down. He walked outside with a cup of coffee in his hand and looked across the field where the new houses stood. The morning sun hit the roofs in a way that almost made them look peaceful. But he knew the truth underneath those perfect walls. Those houses weren't supposed to be there. The land was his. Yet here he was, being treated like he didn't belong on his own property. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in air that felt heavier than usual. He knew there would be no simple way to talk this out. The HOA president had made that clear the day before when she walked around acting like she owned everything. It didn't matter to her who he was or what papers he held. She saw a man who didn't fit into her picture of the neighborhood, and she treated him like an outsider. He tried to shake off those thoughts and got into his truck. Heading to the county office? He didn't want to fight, not if he could help it. What he wanted was understanding, someone who would look at the documents and say, yes, this is wrong. We'll fix it. On the drive there, he practiced what he would say, hoping it would come out steady and respectful. The last thing he wanted was to sound angry. People stopped listening when you raised your voice. When he arrived, the clerk at the front desk gave him a friendly nod. He explained his situation as simply as he could. She listened, her face changing slowly from polite to confused, then to concerned. She excused herself and disappeared into the back. After several long minutes, she returned with a supervisor who asked him to follow her to an office. He sat across from the supervisor, who flipped through papers, pausing at each page like she was searching for something she didn't want to find. After a moment, she leaned back and sighed softly. She explained that there had been a filing error. Someone had misread a renewal form, marked his land as unclaimed, and allowed it to be included in a development project the HOA had proposed. He stared at her, not angry, just stunned. It wasn't the kind of mistake you could laugh off. His land was everything. It held his memories, his work, his stories. And now it had houses sitting on it because of a few wrong marks on a computer screen. She apologized more than once and promised to escalate the issue immediately. She said the HOA should have verified ownership before building anything. They were supposed to check the records, not rely on assumptions. Hearing that didn't make him feel any better. It only made him realize how carelessly everything had been handled. When he stepped back outside into the sunlight, he sat on a bench for a moment and closed his eyes. At least now he knew how it happened. It didn't solve anything yet, but it gave him a direction, a real one, a fair one. Later that afternoon, he returned home to find a small group of neighbors standing at the edge of the houses watching him. He didn't know them, and they didn't come close, but he could feel their curiosity. One of them eventually stepped forward, a man around his age, with a calm face and a steady voice. He said he and some of the others had heard bits of what happened, and he wanted to apologize on behalf of any residents who had unknowingly moved into a place they shouldn't have. The conversation was gentle. The neighbor explained that most folks had trusted the HOA without question. No one imagined they were buying homes built on someone else's land. They had been excited, hopeful, ready for a fresh start. Hearing the truth now left them feeling uneasy, even guilty. The man thanked him for listening and didn't push for details. He simply nodded and walked back to the group, who all slowly drifted away. As the sun began to set, he sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the colors spread across the sky. He thought about the people who lived in the houses. They weren't the ones who planned this. They hadn't meant to harm anyone. They were just people looking for a place to live, same as anyone else. The real issue was the people who approved the project without proper checks. He decided he wouldn't let frustration drive him. He needed patience, steady, thoughtful patience. He knew the process ahead would take time. Meetings, paperwork, maybe even courtrooms. But he wasn't going to be pushed aside anymore. He had been quiet long enough. The next day, he returned to the county office for a follow-up meeting. This time, there were more officials in the room. They apologized again for the mistake and explained the steps they were taking. They assured him that the HOA would be required to compensate him in some form. The houses couldn't be moved, so the solution would likely involve payments, agreements, or shared ownership arrangements. He listened carefully, nodding when needed, and asking clear questions. He didn't demand anything unreasonable. He simply wanted fairness. And as he spoke, he noticed the officials watching him differently, not as someone bitter or confrontational, but as someone trying to handle a tough situation with calm and dignity. Later that evening, he met a young family who lived in one of the houses. They walked over, holding a tray of freshly baked treats. Their way of saying thank you for not directing any frustration toward them. They told him they had moved in only 2 months ago, completely unaware of the land confusion. They admitted they were scared when they first heard the news, unsure if they would have to leave. He reassured them that his intention wasn't to uproot anyone. He told them that people shouldn't have to suffer because of someone else's mistakes. That seemed to give them relief, and they talked a little longer before heading home. He watched them walk away, the children laughing as they chased each other up the driveway. That night, he thought about the future. Not just his own, but the future of the people living there. He could be the kind of person who demanded everything be torn down. But that didn't feel right. He wanted a solution that let everyone live with peace. As the days passed, he noticed a shift. The HOA president, who once spoke to him with cold authority, avoided him now. She knew the situation wasn't in her control anymore. County officials were involved, lawyers had reached out, and documents were being reviewed line by line. But he didn't take joy in seeing her nervous. He didn't want to trip her up or embarrass her. He only wanted what was fair. Still, he couldn't deny that her treatment of him in the beginning had made things harder. If she had really listened, things might have been smoother. One afternoon, he'd walked toward the field again and noticed the neighbor from before, waving him over. The man explained that a group of residents wanted to meet him formally. They wanted to understand what was happening and offer support where they could. He agreed to attend, appreciating the gesture. The meeting took place near the community center. People brought their chairs, stood in circles, and listened as he explained the situation in simple words. He kept his voice calm, focusing on facts rather than emotions. He told them he had no plan to force anyone out and that the county was handling everything. Many people thanked him afterward, some shaking his hand, others offering kind words. In the middle of all this, he received a call from a legal advisor provided by the county. She explained the compensation options they were preparing. They would go over them in detail soon, and he had the right to bring his own lawyer if he wanted. He appreciated how thorough she was. For the first time in months, he felt like someone was finally taking things seriously. As he hung up the phone, he glanced toward the houses again. The sun was dipping behind them, casting long shadows across the field. It had been a long journey already, and there was still more to come. But he felt more grounded now. More sure of himself, he had come back after a year expecting to find his land untouched. Instead, he found houses built without permission. But through patience, steady conversations, and a growing sense of understanding, he had begun shaping a path toward fairness, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. There was still a long way to go. But he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The days that followed felt different. Not easier, but clearer. He woke each morning knowing that conversations were underway. People were paying attention, and the situation was finally being treated with the seriousness it deserved. Even though nothing had been officially solved yet, he could sense the shift around him, like the ground had settled a bit after a long tremor. One morning, he received a call from the legal advisor from the county office. She asked him to come in later that day to review the first set of compensation proposals. Her voice was steady and professional, but warm enough to let him know she genuinely wanted to help him. The moment he hung up, he felt the weight of everything pressing in once again, but not in a frightening way. It felt like progress. He spent the next hour going over his own thoughts. He didn't want to walk into that meeting unprepared or unsure. He wanted to be clear about what mattered to him. He wanted fair compensation, not more or less. He wanted an agreement that protected him moving forward. And he wanted the people living in the houses to have stability too. He wasn't trying to take away their homes. He was trying to fix what had gone wrong. When he arrived at the county office, he was led into a conference room with a long table and a stack of documents placed neatly at one end. The legal advisor smiled politely and gestured for him to sit. She explained each part of the proposal in simple terms, making sure he understood everything. There were options for yearly payments, options for shared profit agreements, and even options that offered him partial ownership stakes in the newly built properties. He listened carefully, nodding slowly as each section was explained. He liked that the county had taken responsibility and was offering different paths, not just pushing one solution. But he also knew this was only a starting point. He asked questions, real ones, thoughtful ones, because he wanted a solution that made sense long term, not just something that looked good on paper. The advisor told him that the HOA would soon be required to sit down with him as well. Officially, under the county's supervision, it wouldn't be a casual meeting. It would be recorded, documented, and handled with clear structure. He appreciated that. He didn't want any more misunderstandings or rushed judgments. When he stepped out of the building, he felt a strange mix of relief and new pressure. Things were moving forward, but that meant the next steps would be even more important. His decisions now would shape what happened to the land, the homes, and the people living there. On his way home, he caught himself thinking about the houses again, their lights, their windows, the little details he had noticed from afar. He wondered how many families inside were worried about what would happen next. He wondered how many had been told anything at all by the HOA. He hoped they weren't being left in the dark. That evening, as he sat on his porch, he heard footsteps approaching slowly. It was the same neighbor who had spoken to him earlier in the week. He greeted him with a small nod and leaned on the porch railing. The neighbor looked concerned, like he'd been thinking hard about something before deciding to walk over. He explained that many residents were nervous because the HOA hadn't told them much about what was happening. They had only heard bits and pieces, mostly rumors. Some people were scared they would lose their homes. Some blamed the HOA. Some felt guilty even though they had done nothing wrong. He listened quietly and assured the neighbor that nothing extreme was going to happen. He repeated what he had said before. He wasn't there to push anyone out. He only wanted what was fair. He wanted people to feel safe. The neighbor nodded with gratitude and said he would share that reassurance with others. Before he left, he added that some residents wanted to start a petition asking the HOA to meet with him directly, without waiting for the county to force it. The idea touched him more than he expected. The next morning, while he drank his coffee, he heard light knocks at his door. When he opened it, a group of residents stood there. Some he recognized, others he didn't. They had come to show support. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a calm, honest one. They explained that many of them didn't trust the HOA anymore. They felt misled. And they wanted to make sure he knew they didn't see him as the problem. He stepped outside and talked with them for a long while, leaning against the railing as they asked questions and shared worries. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He told them he was learning things as they unfolded, just like them. But he promised he would keep trying to find a resolution that didn't hurt anyone. The conversation felt almost like a community circle. People were honest, gentle, and genuinely concerned. And for the first time since he returned to find the houses standing on his land, he felt a sense of connection, not just conflict. Later that afternoon, he received an email from the county setting the official date for the meeting with the HOA. It would take place in a large room at the municipal center, with a mediator present. When he read that, his stomach tightened. He knew he needed to stay calm and steady. This was the moment everything had been building toward. As the day of the meeting approached, he spent more time walking his land, even the parts where the new houses sat. He didn't trespass or approach anyone's doors. He just walked the edges, quietly taking in what had once been open space. He remembered how the land looked when he first inherited it. He remembered the mornings he spent there years ago watching the sunrise with a sense of calm. Now it was filled with driveways, gardens, and fences. He tried not to feel bitter. He tried to focus on solutions, not the loss. He reminded himself that he still had a chance to set things right. When the day of the meeting finally came, he arrived early and sat in the parking lot for a moment, letting his heartbeat slow back down. He walked inside the building and was led to the meeting room where a long table stood exactly the way he imagined. A mediator sat at one end, calm and professional. A few county officials occupied seats along the side, and then came the members of the HOA. The president avoided his eyes at first, her confident posture replaced by a quieter, more guarded one. The other board members looked unsure, shifting in their seats. It wasn't the same atmosphere he had experienced when she first confronted him weeks ago. The balance had changed. When the meeting started, the mediator explained how the discussion would move. Everyone would get a chance to speak. Everyone would remain respectful. Everything said would be recorded. When it was his turn, he spoke clearly, calmly, and without anger. He explained how he had been away for a year caring for a sick relative. He explained how he had come back to find the land changed beyond recognition. And he explained how the mistake in the records had allowed this entire situation to happen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blame anyone directly. He simply stated what had happened, how it affected him, and what he hoped for moving forward. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the HOA president began to speak. Her voice was not as sharp as before. She admitted that they should have checked the land records more carefully. She admitted they should have spoken to him instead of assuming the land was open for development. She didn't offer excuses, just explanations. It wasn't an apology filled with emotion, but it was honest enough to show she understood the seriousness of the situation. The rest of the meeting involved discussions about long-term agreements, payments, property. He listened to every word, took notes, and asked questions. He never interrupted. He never let frustrations spill over. And slowly, everyone in the room seemed to settle into a rhythm where solutions felt possible. By the end of the meeting, preliminary agreement had been reached. It wasn't the final version, far from IT, but it was a clear step. The HOA would begin paying him a structured monthly amount for the land use. Contracts would be drafted to reflect the shared rights. And the HOA would hold a community meeting to inform all residents about the situation and the path forward. When he stepped outside after the meeting, he felt the evening air hit his face like a reminder that the world kept moving, even in tense moments. He walked to his truck slowly, letting the quietness settle into his chest. The situation wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like he could breathe. As he drove home, he thought about everything that had happened. The confusion, the frustration, the endless conversations, the unexpected support from neighbors, and now the beginning of an actual agreement. He knew there would be more work to do, more meetings, more paperwork, more decisions. But he also knew he wasn't fighting alone anymore. People were listening now. People cared. When he got home, he stepped out of the truck and looked toward the houses again. The windows were glowing warmly as families settled in for the night. He didn't feel anger looking at them. Instead, he felt a responsibility to make sure whatever came next protected them just as much as it protected him. He stood there a long time, watching the lights flicker in the distance, knowing that tomorrow would bring new conversations, new choices, and new chances to move toward a fair ending for everyone involved. And for the first time since coming home, he felt something close to peace. The next few weeks moved in a way he didn't expect. Instead of chaos or arguments, there was a calm but steady pace to everything. The county worked on the official paperwork. The HOA followed the agreement. And the residents finally began hearing the truth directly from the people responsible. It didn't solve everything instantly, but it created a sense of honesty that had been missing for a long time. He spent most mornings walking the old edges of his land again. Not because he was checking anything, but because it helped him think. The trees still stood in some corners, their leaves shaking lightly whenever the wind passed. The sunlight looked the same on the grass, even though the shape of the land had changed. He found comfort in that small bit of familiarity. Some days, he would walk past one of the new homes and hear the sound of kids playing inside. Sometimes a dog barked from behind a fence. Life had settled into the land, even if the land had been taken without permission. Oddly, hearing all that made him feel both sad and hopeful at the same time. One afternoon, while he was sitting on his porch going through a stack of documents, he saw a car pull up in front of his house. It was the HOA president. She stepped out slowly, almost cautiously, holding a folder close to her chest. She stood by her car for a moment, as if deciding what to say before even walking toward him. He got up and met her halfway down the walkway. She greeted him politely and said she didn't want to bother him, but she had something to discuss. Her voice was calmer than before, and there was no trace of the defensive tone she used to have. They sat on the porch, and she explained that the HOA board had decided they wanted to formalize a long-term agreement, with him one that protected him legally and also protected the residents who lived on the disputed land. She said the board had voted to offer him a permanent land lease that gave him income for decades, guaranteed yearly increases, and allowed him to maintain ownership of the land itself. She admitted openly this time that the HOA had acted carelessly before. She said that the past few weeks had shown her how important it was to fix things the right way. He listened silently, surprised at how sincere she sounded. When she finished explaining everything, she handed him the folder. Inside were drafts of agreements and letters the HOA planned to send to all residents. She said she wanted him to read everything carefully and take as much time as he needed. She didn't rush him, didn't pressure him. She just said she hoped this could be a good beginning. After she left, he sat on the porch with the folder for almost an hour. He wasn't reading it, just holding it and thinking. It felt strange to realize how far things had come. The same people who once avoided him, who once hoped he would disappear again, were now trying to make things right. Maybe not perfectly, but honestly. The next morning, he drove to his attorney's office, handing over the folder and explaining what the HOA had said. The attorney nodded, flipping through each page and marking things with sticky notes. After a long pause, he said the agreement was fair, maybe even generous. There were still things to adjust, but nothing that looked suspicious or hidden. It was the first time the attorney had looked genuinely relieved. When he returned home, he stood in the driveway for a long moment, looking toward the houses. He realized he didn't feel tension anymore. For weeks, he had carried confusion, frustration, responsibility, and worry. Now he carried something much lighter, a sense that the end was finally within reach. Later that week, the county scheduled a final joint meeting with him, the HOA board, and a few representatives of the residents. It was meant to finalize everything, sign documents, and close the case officially. The room they met in was smaller than the previous one and felt far less tense. People talked normally, some even smiled. It was strange to see such a change, but a good kind of strange. When it was his turn to speak, he simply said he appreciated the effort everyone had made. He said he never wanted conflict. He wanted fairness, and he believed they had finally reached that point. The HOA president nodded, thanking him for his patience. Some of the residents even clapped softly when the meeting ended. When he walked out of the building, it felt lighter than he had in months. The sun was bright, and the air felt cleaner somehow. He didn't rush to get into his truck. Instead, he stood by the door for a moment and let the warm breeze hit his face. Driving home felt different too. The road seemed quieter, the houses less overwhelming. He parked in front of his home and just sat there in the car, thinking about everything that had happened. It was strange how much his life had changed since the day he returned unexpectedly to find those big houses standing on his land. A couple of days later, the HOA held a community meeting and he was invited. He wasn't required to be there, but he wanted to attend. When he walked into the community hall, people greeted him politely. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded with respect. He noticed that the tension that used to follow him whenever he walked around the neighborhood was gone. People no longer whispered or avoided eye contact. The meeting was open and straightforward. The HOA explained the agreement in simple terms. They apologized publicly for the mistakes. Residents asked questions, some serious, some emotional. But through it all, he noticed something important. No one blamed him. They understood that he hadn't caused the problem. He had simply come back to something that wasn't supposed to happen. After the meeting, few residents approached him privately to thank him for not trying to remove anyone from their homes. One family said they had been losing sleep worrying about what would happen. Another person said they respected him for staying calm through everything. Their words warmed him in a way he didn't expect. He left the hall that evening, feeling like the story had shifted from conflict to connection. Not the kind that comes from big gestures, but the quiet kind that grows from honesty and understanding. When he got home, he stepped out of his truck and walked toward the back of his property. The sky was turning orange as the sun set behind the rooftops of the new houses. He stood there, watching the last bit of sunlight hit the windows, turning them gold for a moment. He didn't think about the frustration anymore. He didn't think about the mistakes, or the paperwork, or the long meetings. He thought about how things had settled not perfectly, but peacefully. He thought about how life had filled the land in a way he hadn't expected. The path ahead felt clearer now. He had an agreement that respected him and protected the residents. He had regained control of his property in a way that brought balance instead of conflict. And he had found a strange but genuine sense of calm through the whole journey. He walked a little further, stopping at the spot where he used to stand years ago, long before any houses were built. He remembered the silence back then. Now the silence was replaced by distant laughter, porch lights being switched on, and the soft hum of life. He realized something important in that moment. The land wasn't just his story anymore. It had become part of many stories. Families lived there, children grew there, memories were forming there. And instead of feeling pushed aside, he felt included in a quiet, meaningful way. As the last bit of daylight faded, he turned around and walked back toward his home. He felt steady. He felt whole. He felt grateful that even though everything had gone wrong at the start, it all found a way to end right. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a real one. And as he reached his porch, feeling the cool air settle around him, he knew that sometimes real endings are the best ones. They're the ones that stay